Hello. Today we're going to be taking a look at another piece of a book. The book is called Poor Economics, and it's a very, very good read. It's by the economist Abhijit Bannerjee and Esther Duflo. Uh, Here they are. They are professors of economics at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. They are also the winners of the 2019 Nobel Prize in Economics. Um, and again, largely for the work that is summarized in the book Poor Economics. It's a whole career's worth of work researching what life is really like in some of the world's poorest areas, and what kind of measures seem to make a difference and what kind of measures seem not to make a difference, and why. So they've done as much work as anybody on the economics of poverty worldwide, and so again, certainly we should give them a listen. So this particular chapter, this piece of the chapter anyway, concerns food and food policy. So we're going to be moving from the last topic, which we discussed, which was famine, into the slightly less urgent, just hunger. Okay, just what is the relationship between food and poverty, globally speaking? And so just like the last one, this one begins with a received view. Now recall, the received view of something is the view that sort of everybody has or shares or learns, but that's generally false, okay? So in general, there is this received view about poverty, and this view is that poverty is primarily about hunger, right? What it means to be poor is not having enough food, right? If you have enough food, you're not poor. If you don't have enough food, then you're poor, right? That's a very, very common idea, but unfortunately, the idea is not true, despite how widespread. And so again, I want to bring up this theme of skepticism, just as the last time. The only way to get rid of various kinds of received views, right, all these things that just seem perfectly obvious and yet aren't true, is if we maintain a kind of skeptical worldview. Okay, so this idea that poverty is primarily about hunger has a number of different features to it, of different ingredients. So first off, almost all public assistance programs globally certainly concern the distribution of food, and usually cheap food, like low cost calories, grains, things like that. So the idea is this, oh, look, if somebody doesn't, if somebody is very poor, that must mean they don't have enough food, and so we're going to send some really cheap food, right? That's a very, very common response, and we'll see how in some ways this response is wrong-headed by the end of the lecture. In the global consciousness, in general, poverty and hunger are synonymous. If you think of the TV commercials that solicit donations to help the world's poorest, is it educate the children? Is it build houses for the children? Is it supply internet access for the children? No, it's feed the children, right? That resonates, I guess, with people. And certainly there are children in the world in need of food, but it's as we'll see, not the biggest concern of the largest number. And of course, in most places, including the United States, the poverty line in countries that make such a distinction is it's calculated as a function of the cost of food. In fact, the official poverty measure, right, used by the United States to determine qualification for all kinds of things, to determine the official poverty line in the United States is a very old formula based on very old data that just gets sort of adjusted for inflation, even though some fundamental assumptions of the model aren't that great. So the idea is that in order to be the poverty line in the United States is set at the food cost, right, minimum food cost for a family of whatever size. Of course, bigger the family, the higher the minimum food cost, right? But you take that minimum food cost in 1963 and you multiply it by 3 and then adjust for inflation. That's how you get where the United States poverty line is. Now think of that for a minute and think of your actual household budget, right? Think of the things that you pay for every month, right? And think largest to smallest, right? Largest is probably housing. Okay, if you pay a mortgage or rent, that's probably the single largest amount of money that you part with at a time. There may be exceptions, but for most people, it's going to be the housing. And so behind that, perhaps it's transportation, right? If you have a car payment, right? If you don't have a car payment, well, then you probably don't pay quite as much for transportation, but you know certainly have to add that in. You have to, you know, if you have a car, you have to pay for car insurance, you have to pay for fuel, you have to pay for the occasional repair and maintenance. If you take a bus, you got to pay for bus tickets, you know, et cetera, right? And in some sense, there's also a cost in time, sometimes using public transportation over private. Depending where you live. Sometimes the public transportation is actually faster than driving your own car, and that's, you know, all to the good in those places. But in any case, again, think of entertainment costs or communication costs. So like an internet bill, a cell phone bill, those are practical necessities these days. If you think about medical care, right? I mean, that has become a huge part of people's energy. Okay, so if you're paying for, you know, heating, electric, water, you know, public utilities, etc. So all of those sorts of things, like, so start adding it up and adding it up and adding it up, and now think of how much you how much you spend on food compared to all of those things, right? I mean, really add it up on a sort of month by month basis. So if you take, you know, I mean, say that you spend, just take whatever you spend on food and sort of multiply it by 3. Is that really going to be enough to cover your entire budget? Honestly, I don't think it is, right? And certainly, I think few of you are probably living on what you would consider a minimum diet, right? So like a minimum cost. I doubt that each of your sort of everyday is consumed with how can I spend the least on food as possible, right? Because food generally is very cheap compared to other things. And that's one of the biggest problems with the United States as poverty measure, is that food has become cheaper in comparison with other goods over the years. Certainly since this formula was invented in, again, the early 60s. So you know, the idea, and the idea is that there are a lot of costs that households bear now that they didn't really bear in 1963. So the system is a little messed up, okay? But it's a symptom of this received view, this idea that poverty and hunger are basically one and the same thing, or that one is essentially defined in terms of the other, right? So again, we'll come back to this issue, but it's enough now to sort of lay out the elements of the received view. And so at this point, I would like to point out that or help to explain some of the technicalities here, right? These people are economists, and so they use charts and graphs like this as if they make a great deal of sense on their own, and I'm not positive that they really do. And so I'm gonna point at these a little bit. I'm gonna bring up my little pointer. Okay, so here is let's start with this. They call this an L-shaped curve. This is what they mean by calling an L-shaped curve. Takes a lot of imagination to call that an L-shaped curve. I would have called it more like a boomerang-shaped curve, or, you know, something like that. Maybe logarithmic. It looks vaguely logarithmic to me, I guess. Okay, you know, whatever. So in any case, this shape of a curve is supposed to be a relationship between income tomorrow, that is income in the future, and income today, that is the present. And this kind of a curve, I think, is supposed to, it's supposed to represent a fairly normal progression over time, right? The idea is that, you know, early in your life, your idea is that you sort of your income tomorrow, what the income you expect later, is going to be a lot higher than what you're making sort of right now at any given moment, right? And so if your income tomorrow and your income today was perfectly equal all the time, then this would be the line. It would be this sort of equality diagonal right through the middle. But the idea is that most people, for most of your lives, you sort of expect to make more in the future than you do right now, and that expectation generally gets borne out, and that generally tends to level off over time, right? Until, you know, you start to sort of, you know, plateau a little bit, and then you hit something like retirement, and then at that point you expect to be making less in the future than you make now, right? Or at least the same, or something like that. You want to coast long enough to, But again, this is a sort of fairly typical sort of curve, I guess. But what they're trying to draw attention to is this notion here, where at the low end of the scale there might be something that they call here, they label it a poverty trap zone. And this is a place in the curve where your income income in the future is actually lower than your income today, right? And that's one of those. So let me give a kind of example of how something like that might work. So imagine that you lose your job because you don't have a certain kind of training, right? And because you lose your job, you can't then afford to get this certain kind of training, right? And because you can't afford that training, then you can't afford to advance, and then you can't afford to get the training, right? So it seems that would be a kind of education-based poverty trap, right? So if the idea was the reason you didn't have the training was because you couldn't afford it, and the reason you can't afford it is because you don't have the training to give you enough money to be able to afford it, right? It's those kinds of things that are sort of poverty traps. Some people call them vicious cycles or something like that, but poverty trap is as good a name for it as anything, where there's some factor where being poor helps to keep one poor, right? And so there might be other things. There might be, say somebody gets sick or injured and they need to be able to afford some kind of medical intervention or medical treatment, but because they don't have enough money for the medical treatment, they end up losing income because they can't work as effectively or perhaps even at all. And so what that means is they're now in a poverty trap zone. Because they couldn't afford the medical care, they can't get the income that they would have needed to afford the medical care, right? And so that's, again, a kind of medical-based poverty trap. So the question that Bannerjee and Duflo want to ask in this chapter of their book is there a hunger-based poverty trap? So this is what they mean, right? They ask you to imagine this kind of a situation. They say, imagine that you don't earn enough money to properly nourish yourself. It is plausible then to think that this means that you will be unable to work as effectively tomorrow, which means less pay in the future than today, making your nutritional situation worse, and so on. Right, so that would be a thing where, again, being poor would keep one poor, right? Being unable to afford enough food means being unable to work enough to be able to afford enough food, right? And so you can see the sort of inherent logic of this kind of a trap, right? That's what we would call a hunger-based poverty trap. And so if there is such a thing that does play a part in the lives of a large number of the world's poorest, then that would be something to address. And again, it does make sense, okay? And so the question becomes, is this, right, a significant part of the lives of the world's poorest? And so one way to get evidence about that question, whether the world's poorest do face some version of a hunger-based poverty trap, one question you could ask is, do the poor eat as much as they can? Okay, so the idea is that you can see all kinds of situations in which some of the world's poorest, if you sort of pay attention to what's going on, in times or places where they get a little bit more money, the question is, do they then turn that money into extra calories, right? Do they eat as much as they can to again try and get out of this sort of hunger-based poverty trap? Banerjee and Duflo notice something very interesting, and the fact is, in general, that additional income among the world's poorest does not translate so very reliably into additional food spending. In fact, they point out a typical food income relationship, right, amongst the world's poorest, in the sense that every 100 units of additional income translates into only about 2/3 of that in terms of additional food spending. So interestingly enough, no, the poor do not eat as much as they can. Well, what does that mean? Okay. So one of the things that means is that more income generally means better tasting food rather than simply more calories. Okay, and Banerjee and Duflo themselves in some of their own studies found that in rural India, more income meant more spending on wheat, rice, and sugar, right, which are more expensive per calorie than millet. Okay, so here's the thing. If you have never eaten millet, I would recommend it at some point, not because it's really great to eat, but just so that you'll be able to say, oh, I ate millet, I know what it's like. It's a very boring food. It's to me, it seems like quinoa. I know some people really like quinoa. I kind of think it tastes like a dirty old tree branch, right? It's a very unexciting food. And, wheat, rice, and sugar are more tasty comparatively, right? Rice is great if you're really hungry and want like 6,000 or something. The old Mitch Hedberg one-liner, right? Another couple of economists, Jensen and Miller, that Banerjee and Duflo cite, they did some studies in rural China when some randomly selected poor households were offered subsidized wheat or rice. That is, they were offered wheat or rice at lower than market prices. Their consumption of those staples actually decreased. Okay, they ate less of those things, and their total caloric intake remained constant or even decreased, right? They even ate sometimes less calories when they had more money, and that seems strange from a certain point of view. And so the idea is, how do we make sense of that? Okay. If you want more data, here it is in the form of another fancy infographic. This shows median per capita expenditure. That's MPCE, median per capita expenditure. That's essentially how much money per person people spend on average. Okay, and how much money people spend is a pretty good indicator of how much money they have. If they're spending more money, they're having more money. Okay. And then, of course, that's the blue line. Okay, that's this line here. The red line here is calorie intake, and notice it goes from like 1983 all the way up to the recent past. And so you'll notice a kind of inverse relationship between these two things, right? As incomes have have increased, right? As the amount of disposable income people have increased, the amount of calories being consumed per day has actually fallen. And again, what I encourage you to do is sort of, pause the video here and sort of start to think of some explanations, maybe even write down a list of things. What could explain why people are eating less as they get richer, right? You might come up with some very plausible answers, but again, pause for a second and we'll see if, you might come up with some of the same things. Okay, so if some of the things you came up with might seem plausible, so one of the things you might have said is, oh, well, look, since the 80s, right? I mean, that's been gosh, by now almost 40 years. Since then, you might assume that rural India has, which might consist largely of people in agriculture, may have become more mechanized, right? There might be a lot more mechanization and a lot more use of, sort of power implements, and that might make it a lot less dependent on manual labor, okay? Which means that people don't need to eat as much in order to get the same amount of work done. If that's one of the things you thought of, that's pretty plausible, actually. And so that increase in efficiency also means an increase in incomes as well. The world is a lot richer than it used to be. And so that's something that certainly happens, is that, overall, people's dependence on manual labor tends to be decreasing every year, and their efficiency tends to be increasing every year as a result. So that might explain both the higher incomes and the lower need for food. Okay, so that's certainly one thing that might be plausible. But it might be any number of other things that also that Bannerjee and Duflo discuss at a later point. So let's discuss those now. So one proposal, one thing that sometimes, and there are dozens of books written that suggest exactly this. They see data of this kind, or they see information like this, or they see, usually it's more anecdotal. It's like, oh, I saw some person who, was poor and they spent some money on X, right, or something like that. That seemed unwise to them. So the idea is like, well, that must be why they're poor, because they spend their money on X instead of on food or something like that, right? That's like I said, it's a very, very common view, but it's a dubious starting place, right? So again, if we're going to ask the question, are the poor irrational, we should, sort of halt for a second and start thinking a little bit more. And again, this is going to highlight what I hope has been a pretty obvious theme in philosophy up to this point. And it is that philosophy is driven by reason. Okay, if you're going to be thinking philosophically, if you're going to be thinking well about something, you're going to have to be committed to the notion of reason really being powerful here. Okay, every argument, every position, every view has to be rationally critiqued and defended. Even positons have to be rationally critiqued and defended, not just positions. Getting better at reasoning means getting better at everything. Okay, and that's going to be again. I hope this is a theme that you've seen as part of the value of philosophy. But let's return. Okay, are the poor irrational? Look, probably not. Okay, this is a really dubious starting place. Individual people are occasionally irrational, all right? But entire populations are not systematically irrational in this way, right? In the way that if there's something that would obviously benefit somebody, people on average take advantage of that benefit. People respond to incentives. If economics has not been clear about that, then by now, then nothing is, right? So that's certainly there's that. It's again a dubious starting place. And so Banerjee and Duflo are going to begin with the premise that the poor know what they're doing and have some good reasons for it. And so what we really want to know is, what are those reasons? Okay, what good reasons are there? Put it this way. If you were in the same situation, right, that these people were in, you would probably make the exact same choices because there are some good reasons to make those choices, right? And so that's going to be the place to start from. Not from, it's like, wow, they must be poor because they're dumb or something like that. Again, many books have been written suggesting just that thing, but highly dubious. So again, let's repeat something that we saw demonstrated in the last lecture. In today's world, there really are actually plenty of calories available for everyone. Except in rare circumstances, sufficient calories for survival are easily affordable even for those subsisting on less than $1 purchasing power parity per day. Okay, so as economists, they use this measure, this dollar PPP thing, right? Excuse me. So here's what that is. This PPP stands for purchasing power parity, right? Try and say that without spitting all over the person you're talking to. This is one of those things where there's actually a rule where if you're at a cocktail party with economists, they don't are allowed to serve crackers because otherwise they'll blow the crackers in your face by saying purchasing power parity or something like that. I'm kidding, but they should have a rule. Okay, so in any case, this idea of purchasing power parity works this way. I think most of you are probably familiar with the idea of adjusting for inflation, right? So if you talk about like, $10 in 1980, that's of course the equivalent of more money today because of inflation, right? But you also have probably the notion if you've traveled abroad anywhere. So for example, if you've gone down to Mexico, you probably have noticed that once you translate the currencies, once you exchange the currencies, things generally are cheaper in Mexico than they are in the United States. There are of course some exceptions, but for the most part, stuff is cheaper in Mexico than it is in the US. And actually, some things are cheaper in some parts of the US than other parts of the US, right? So the idea is that we know that there's some regional variation in how much stuff costs. Even in the same unit of currency. The idea of purchasing power parity is to adjust for all of that, right? To sort of level out all those differences. And so the idea is that $1 of purchasing power parity might be something like 40 cents in Addis Ababa, or it might be something like $1.10 in Miami or something, So, but that's the idea, is that the equivalent of living on $1 per day anywhere. So that's the idea, sort of adjusting for all that regional variation. So imagine living on exactly $1 per day of income here in Kansas City, right, in the greater Kansas City area, right? You think, I can't do that, right? It's like, well, again, think not necessarily thriving, certainly, but just living, just staying alive, okay? So think of the things you cannot afford on $1 per day, right? And you think to yourself, housing, absolutely, you cannot afford any kind of housing on $1 per day. You're basically you're sleeping outside wherever you can. That's so you cannot afford housing on this, but you can be alive without housing, right? It's no fun, right? But think transportation, it's pretty rough. I mean, so some public transit at a reduced fare may be available sometimes, right? But certainly not too much. You certainly can't buy a car, for 30 plus insurance plus gas for a dollar per day. That's not feasible. Energy costs, again, not feasible. Communication, not so much. I mean, you might be able to get a very, very cheap sort of like a prepaid phone plan if you only use a minute here or there, as a sort of for something like that cost. But again, that's using up, perhaps a month's income or something like that, and that's not feasible for most cases. So, think of all the things that people have to pay for, and all the things you just can't afford on $1 per day. But now let's get to food. Right? Think about food. You think, oh God, $1 a day, I couldn't eat them. Hang on a second, right? What's a dozen eggs cost at the supermarket? You think to yourself, well, right around $1. Okay. Is a dozen eggs a day enough to sort of keep you alive and kicking? It's probably more than enough, right? What about a pound of bananas? I mean, bananas are usually, so like 20 cents a pound, 30 cents a pound. I mean, they're not expensive. Look, if you're willing to eat mostly eggs and bananas, things or rice and beans or, various other things like that, you can absolutely get enough calories to survive on $1 a day. Right. And so again, imagine subsisting at that level. It seems like basically the only basic need you can really take care of on $1 per day is your food needs. right? Everything else is, sort of not there. So again, now imagine that somebody says, all right, to help you out, I'm going to give you food, right? Or to make sure that you can get food. It's like, well, look, I could already get that on this meager income. It's everything else that I can't get. And if you just give me more food, it's like, well, okay, great. I have some food plus $30 a month. Yeah, that's going to get me a lot. So again, this notion of responding to poverty with primarily food aid is a bit wrongheaded. Certainly, you want to respond to hunger issues. If somebody just cannot, afford enough food, yeah, you're going to want to give them food. But to pretend that then that solves, their more major problems is, in a sense, giving somebody food is solving the least of most people's troubles if they're living at less than $1 purchasing parity per day. And in fact, about 1 billion people on Earth do live this way, right? The bottom billion live routinely on less than $1 purchasing power parity per day. So what this means is, as Bannerjee and Duflo point out, that there are actually very few in this hunger-based poverty trap, even among the world's very poorest. So for example, in 2004, only 2% of the world's poorest said that they did not have enough food. So again, we don't want to downplay the issues of where food security is a problem, because where it is a problem, it's a problem. But it's not the biggest problem for the majority of the world's poorest, despite how we tend to think of that as being the major problem. And so this is where their article turns from good into really good, okay? And this is where they say, okay, so they could have stopped there and just said, yeah, it's not really all about the food, it's about a lot of other things. But instead they say, look, they're skeptical even of their skeptical position here. They took a skeptical view that there really are hunger-based poverty traps as part of the lives of the world's poorest routinely. But they're also skeptical of their skeptical position as well, and that's always to the good. That turns it into a really great article. So it seems like there still is room to look for some form of poverty trap that has something to do with food, but that perhaps doesn't stem from a simple lack of calories. That is, it doesn't stem from a lack of quantity of food. So consider some of the following information. So here's a chart, a graph that shows the percentage of children stunted by income. Okay, so think, what is stunted? It doesn't mean like, skateboards and elbow pads or whatever. No, that's not. So stunted as in their growth is inhibited, usually due to malnutrition. That's the biggest factor in terms of stunting, right? Is that people don't realize their full genetic potential due to lack of quality nutrition. And so again, you can see that there's a big difference between in both India and in Senegal, the two countries on this graph, between the richest 20%, the middle 20%, and the poorest 20% in terms of stunting, right? And so that's got to have something to do with food, right? Again, maybe not the quantity of food, but probably the quality of food. Okay. And some other information that Bannerjee and Duflo bring up in this vein. Here's a chart that shows the medal count, right? The number of the per capita Olympic medals at various Olympics between 2012 and 2008. Plotted against per capita GDP, so that is wealth. Okay, so think of it this way, right? If you're looking at like think about high school athletics in this country, right? Do we divide up schools based on how much money the people who go to those schools have, right? So is like a class 3A school poorer than a class 5A school, like per capita? Like do the individual people at one school? It's like maybe in some cases that's true, but that's not really. I mean, that's not really how that works, right? Usually that like a 1A, 2A, 3A, 4A, et cetera, that we have in most, high school classifications, usually that's the size of the school. Because the logic is the bigger the school, the greater the chances that you've got more good athletes in that school than if you have a very small school. And so like the schools with lots of people are going to be the schools with more good athletes, and so more good sports teams. And so the idea is you want to sort of match people up size for size, not really anything else. But notice how tightly this correlation looks, right? The correlation is between sort of money, right, and medal count, not so much population size and medal count. You'd expect population size to be a much bigger factor, but it's actually money, right? And again, you can pause it and think, why, right? And if you came up with things like, well, look, you got more people who could afford to devote their lives to sports or something like that, That's partially true, right? If you think of like training facilities and other kinds of technology that some countries can afford that others can, that's again partially true. But what we should see is we should see that all happening here at the top end, and that's what's sort of separating some of the richest countries from each other is how rich or how much are they really spending on this, whereas the countries that aren't spending hardly anything at all, it should just be the bigger the country, the more the medals. But it doesn't look like it does that. It looks like the economics of it go all the way sort of down. Again, Bannerjee and Duflo suggest this might have something to do with the quality of nutrition overall. So case in point, take the nation of India, right? It's the world's second largest nation. So, got 1.3 billion people in India, right? They sent 117 athletes to the 2016 Olympics, which was their largest contingent ever. The most people they ever sent to the Olympics. It's also, again, the second most populous country in the world. It's 1.33 billion people. And China, they're actually very close to China. China has 1.38 billion people. Okay, so predict how many medals then out of 117 athletes, how many medals did India win, right? In 2016 Olympics. You could probably look this up, but here it is. Here's their medal count. It's probably lower than you thought. Okay, so they were actually ranked 67th, right? They have no gold medals, none, not a one, right? One silver, one bronze, two total medals for the second most populous country in the world. Okay, and so again, a lot of that has to do with the number of people who, due to a lack of quality nutrition, not necessarily quantity of nutrition, who are perhaps not achieving their full genetic potential, right? And that's where the quality of nutrition may come in more than its quantity. Bangladesh is another case in point in terms of this. Bangladesh, look, 100 million people live in Bangladesh. It's not a tiny country, okay? It's about a third to a fourth of the size of the United States, right? I mean, that's, it's lots of people live there. It's big. You figure they should have had, somebody, right, who could, do something, maybe they're a great biathlete or whatever. That's, well, I don't know how much skiing you can really do in Bangladesh. I don't know. But in any case, again, with 100 million people, you'd figure the medal count should be maybe not super high, but higher than it really is. Here's Bangladesh's actual all-time medal count for all Olympics ever. It's none, and it's incredible, right? Again, what's going on here? So in order to figure out what might be going on here, we have to stop focusing on calories and again start focusing on quality, right? Not quantity, but quality of nutrition. So let's talk about, say, for example, anemia. Anemia is an example that Bannerjee and Duflo bring up. Anemia is a condition that is primarily due to a lack of dietary iron. There are other conditions that can cause anemia, but they're more rare. Most often, right, anemia is caused by a lack of dietary iron, which is usually gained by eating meat, although there are other, fruits and vegetables that can give you plenty of iron. Anemia causes lethargy, weakness, and low aerobic capacity, right? So if you're talking about a kind of condition that would make somebody less productive, anemia is definitely on the table as far as those go. Iron, in the jargon of all this, is what we call a micronutrient. Okay, this is as opposed to a macronutrient like a sugar or a fat or something like that. Iron supplements could be, right, very cheaply utilized even among the world's poorest. Bannerjee and Duflo mention an iron fortified fish sauce that would cost about $7 purchasing power parity per year, right, to use this stuff. Now, if you haven't had fish sauce, I strongly recommend it. It's very common in a lot of South Asian cuisine. And you can get it at any supermarket, right? It's not hard to find. And here's my advice, though. Taste it, don't smell it, right? It smells real funky. But it really adds just a kind of bang of flavor. Do you use kind of like a condiment, just sprinkle a little over basically almost anything that you're cooking, sort of while you're cooking it, and then it again, it just adds this really, really nice flavor to almost everything. It's a great condiment, right? But in any case, why though, right? Why should it be the case that this isn't very often used, even if it's quite available cheaply? Like $7 purchasing power parity per year. Okay, that's 1 week's of income out of the entire year, right? To address something like this. Is anemia a problem in the world's poorest areas? If you look at this map, yes. Anemia is very much a much larger problem in some of the world's poorer areas, and very much less a problem in the world's richest areas. You see here these dark blues, right? Least anemia in the world. These sort of, reds and oranges and yellows, more anemia, right? I mean, yeah, obviously there's a correlation between wealth and anemia. And so could there be a kind of micronutrient-based poverty trap as opposed to a calorie-based poverty trap? So a lack of productivity can make a diet more basic, okay, which in turn would make an individual less productive. And despite the availability, and so look, that would be this idea, right, that a lack of productivity could make a diet more basic, and then that the fact that the diet's more basic might make an individual less productive or anemic or something else like that. Sure, that's totally plausible. Again, though, despite the availability and low cost of nutritional supplements, they are generally not in widespread use, right? They probably could make a real difference here, but again, a lot of people don't use them. Why? Right? What's going on? Yeah. And so this is another thing that Bannerjee and Duflo have been studying for kind of a long period of time, and it's very much described in their book. They say, like, why is it that the poor tend to resist all these attempts to improve their nutrition? And again, assume they're not just irrational, right? Assume that if you were in their position, you'd be making more or less the same kinds of decisions. And so here's some of the things that can explain that. First off, a lack of any obvious evidence that these micronutrients are effective, right? So even if they are very cheap isn't zero, right? Very cheap isn't nothing. It's still something. It still is an expense, and if you're kind of living on the edge of everything, that matters. And here's the thing: anybody, think to yourself, have you ever taken a vitamin? Okay, like like a multivitamin or a vitamin of any kind. Okay, did you feel like Superman? Like, did you notice that it was like, oh, I took this vitamin, now I can lift 50 more pounds or so, like that's not how it works. You don't really feel any different in the short term, right? You don't notice any change at all from when you really do take them, when you really don't take them. You might convince yourself that you do, but mostly the people who market these things are, like hope that you'll convince yourself you do. For the most part, it's, the differences are really marginal and they're really sort of long term, and they make a much bigger difference if we're talking about like really early childhood nutrition than if we're talking about just like if you change your diet as an adult or something and start taking a vitamin. Again, you don't feel like Superman when you take a vitamin. So again, if it costs something and it doesn't seem to make any obvious difference, why bother? Okay, that's a decision anybody might make. And you might say, okay, well, yes, but I mean, then there's all this education that you could do. It's like, well, yes, but that education is expensive too, and you can't necessarily expect people to sort of pay for all that education if they just don't have that much money, right? So there you go. Also, imagine a bunch of people like who dress funny, come to your hometown and come to your house, and they don't really speak your language very well, and they don't really know anything about your life, and they start telling you that you are eating all the wrong things and you have to eat different stuff, including stuff that's, perhaps more expensive or that's not how you quite spend your money. How's that going to go over, right? Again, as you might imagine, it doesn't go over that well. So people generally trust strangers who try and tell them what to eat. And of course, the world's poorest, like anybody would in those circumstances, have different priorities, okay, than you would think that they would, standing from some abstract outside situation. So, for example, when we talk about different priorities, what we mean is that there are lots of things that are just more important than food. Okay, and that's not just for the world's poorest, that's for everybody. We oftentimes, I say we, but people who are not among the world's poorest, that's what I mean by we. We tend to look at the world's poorest, in other societies. We even oftentimes people look at the poor in our own society, and they think that, that looking from outside, they think, oh, I would do things differently, and I would never be in such a situation, and and I don't know. I think some of that is fairly bogus. So consider some examples like this. So for example, the consumption of cheap calories, right, is oftentimes just associated with being poor, right? People don't really enjoy that. Um, so again, if you're sort of some rich hipster, you'll go ahead and enjoy eating your quinoa or your millet or whatever. But if you sort of don't have any other choice, that quinoa, that millet's not very exciting, and you'd sort of love a change. You'd love something else, something better, something a little more exciting. So for example, uh, I heard stories of people, who might have grown up very poor. So I know one particular person who, grew up pretty poor, right? Their, family just didn't have much money, and there were some days in which his family Um, like, a couple of weeks before payday, and the money's kind of run out, and so what they have to eat is essentially like oatmeal. And so it's, oatmeal a couple times a day, and that's it. That's what they got because it's very, very cheap. And we're not talking like oatmeal with like milk and sugar and lots of fruit and all that sort of stuff in it. If you could afford all those things, you wouldn't just be eating oatmeal, right? No, it's pretty much just sort of, boiled water oatmeal. It's very, very bland. You get tired of eating that a long time before you get, sort of filled up. Um, it's very boring. It's very, very bland. Not very exciting. And so, I mean, to this day, do you think that guy eats oatmeal? Right? No, it just reminds him of being poor. That's and that's just psychologically, again, anybody in the same circumstances might make the same choice. Um, in addition, right, when the poor tend to have extra income, they do tend to spend it on things that make life more worthwhile. Again, let me, we'll enumerate some of these things like festivals or television or special, better tasting foods, right, or clothing or art and craft, right, to satisfy other basic human needs. And so again, let me put it to you this way. You hear people say all the times like, oh, well, I'd love to give this person money, but I'm afraid they won't spend it on food or something like that. Well, of course they want to spend it on food. Again, imagine you're in their situation. Imagine you just, you only have, you have very little money, very, very little. Okay. Or even just imagine you're in your current circumstances, right? Could you, right, eat basically nothing but like beans and rice, eggs and bananas, like the bare sort of minimum expense diet, like, for the next year, and then use that money that you would have saved to do something that will make a real difference in your life? Could you do that? Right? I think the answer clearly, yes, absolutely, you could do that. Are you gonna? Right? And are you irrational if you don't? Are you somehow just being stupid? Okay. And I think, you might resent that implication. Like, could you avoid buying any more clothes of any kind for the next 2 years? Right? I bet you could. And I bet you'd be just fine. And could you use then the money that you would have spent on some of those clothes and put it towards something that really would make a real difference in your life? Could you do it? Right? Again, I think the answer is probably yes. uh, are you gonna? Right. Again, you shouldn't look down on people for making the exact same kinds of choices that you would make in their situation. So again, imagine you got $5 to your name and somebody gives you $10. Are you going to say, "Hey, look, it's my chance to get out of poverty"? Right? That would be ridiculous, right? You say, "Hey, I could, have a pretty nice meal with this, right? I could have a good time. I could, do something special, right? Maybe I'll go see a movie for goodness sakes, right? To alleviate, the boredom of what is otherwise my daily life." Yeah, you might make those kinds of decisions. Imagine all your friends are going to be going out for some really expensive dinner, like, way more than you would usually spend on a meal, and you're kind of on a budget. Might you like skip lunch for a few days, to sort of end up paying for this sort of extra special good time later? Sure, right? So again, people sacrifice some needs for other needs all the time, right? And again, if you're living on a very tight budget, you probably do that more often. And so again, that's it's a very normal, very human thing to do, right? There's nothing special about the world's poorest that they're making these weird decisions. They're not weird at all, right? They're the kinds of decisions anybody would make, which is why they're the decisions that everybody in fact is making. And so, at long last, we have to come back around to the original question. Notice this is a metaphysical issue, right? We're trying to say, what is poverty, right? We're trying to analyze our concept, right? And if our concept of poverty is off, then any kind of anything we do to try and alleviate it is going to be off. And so what we can do is we can take our concept and we can put it in various situations to see how well it fits, just like we did with the concept of identity in our metaphysics unit. And if if our concept fits better with our data, it fits better with certain situations, well, then we think it's probably a better concept. So this concept that poverty is just about hunger doesn't fit, right? It doesn't fit with what we know. It doesn't fit with what ultimately makes sense, and so we have to replace it with something else. Where again, I hope this is a theme that you've noticed throughout the course, but I hope you noticed it throughout these last readings as well, is that hiding behind issues of any importance at all are a whole bunch of difficult philosophical questions, right? Questions about what our concepts entail, questions about what proves this or doesn't prove that, questions about what kind of evidence we have and how trustworthy it is, right? I mean, these are all very basic questions, and if you get better at thinking about these kinds of things from their most abstract level, the way that philosophers do, you're probably going to be better at thinking about them generally. And only when you examine what questions there are, will your attempts at answers be in any way productive. And so I think at this point we have to conclude that poverty is not simply a lack of calories. Poverty is not hunger. Okay. Although it seems to be true that a lack of quality nutrients, as opposed to quantity of nutrients, seems to play a significant role in the way that certainly in the outcomes of some of the world's poorest versus those in the world who are not as poor. And modern poverty is poverty in today's world, okay, as opposed to hundreds of years ago or even decades ago, seems to be less a condition of absolute deprivation than a condition of relative inequality, right? Another way to put it, I think, I forget where I heard this, but someone had said it seems like poverty is these days much more about instead of being hungry or being shelterless or being sort of like focusing on one factor, you want to say the more often you have to trade something you need in exchange for something else that you need, right? So do without something that you need in order to get something else that you need. So the more often you're trading needs against needs, the more likely you are to be in a condition of poverty, right? That's what poverty really means, is being in a situation where you're forced to trade needs for other needs instead of trading wants for needs, or even wants for other wants, right? So if you're never trading any needs for needs, you're not poor, right? That's and I think that once we put the definition that way, I think that the idea of like who's poor and who isn't takes a much more effective gradient. Okay, it makes much more sense, right? And so I'm going to end it with this, right? So again, consider that so much of our attempts to deal with poverty globally and even domestically concern the distribution of just more cheap calories. Okay, so again, imagine you're one of those people living on a dollar purchasing power parity per day, and like the one thing you actually can afford on that meager income is enough food to live, and somebody else is giving you more sort of just cheap basic food, right? That you're like, well, I can already afford that, and you're not like, no matter how much of that you give to me, it's not really helping me. Again, a person can have as much food as they could want, as they could ever want, and more, and still be poor. Okay, so imagine winter is coming, right? And you're in a very tough situation. Maybe you're living, you're living out on the streets. But the one thing you have is a pretty good coat, right? That you're not that worried about, sort of staying warm in that basic level, in the sense that you've got one pretty good coat. And imagine that some very well-meaning individuals hold this coat drive and they give you a really nice coat, and you're like, okay, I appreciate the sentiment, but that's like the one thing I already had. And so notice that doesn't seem to help. Again, somebody can have as many clothes as they want and still be poor, right? And so I think, what's the one thing, if you really want to help somebody who's poor, if you want to help the world's poor generally, what's the one thing that you can't have a whole bunch of and still be poor, right? There's only one answer to this question. It's of course money, right? Can you have a whole bunch of money and still be poor? Well, no, actually. And so again, giving somebody money allows them to make some decisions on their own, right? It allows them to, because they probably have a better idea of what their priorities are than you do. And so, again, whether they do what you think you would have done in that situation or not, that's pretty irrelevant. If you really want to help somebody who doesn't have a lot of money, you should give them more money, right? That's a more sensible approach, because it, comes out of a better understanding of just what poverty really is.